Hello, Mr. Kitchen. How's your new year been?
So far, so good, Matt. The first entire week.
Yeah. Wow. Seems like only yesterday that we were in 2024. But okay, well, first
Well,
I just wanted to thank you so much for giving me your everything, including the kitchen sink book at price last month.
well, good. I hope you enjoyed it.
Oh, I have while I have been too busy to read the entire thing, I have I've been reading sections of it, and it's been very eye-opening to like how comics were back in like the 60s and 70s and 80s like compared to now. I grew up in the internet era.
Sure.
I'm used to the big publishers like the Marvel, DC, Image, IDW, Boom Studios, but I've also used the internet, so I've read a lot of web comics, from creators who just want to, make their own stories, without any of the, without any of the licensing that you would have with something like, let's say, Image. So, and that was really eye-opening to me as a aspiring writer.
Okay.
Uh, I guess,
Well,
oh, no, you go.
no, I'm glad to hear that background. Obviously, you're a lot younger. You get to talk today to a living dinosaur. So let me see if I can help you fill in some gaps in your in lost knowledge you're curious about. Where do you want to start?
Well, speaking of dinosaurs, I'm so glad you mentioned that. You work with Mark Schultz.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I again, I am 23 years old, but I am aware of the animated series, video game, and
Hmm.
comic
Okay.
Cadillacs and dinosaurs. I try to be knowledgeable of like all these cult classics and such. I heard like years ago that he was trying to like make a novel continuation of Cadillacs and Dinosaurs. Is that true? Is he
Well,
still?
he's been working for a number of years on a terrific, I guess, chapter in Xenozoic that gives it a definitive beginning, middle, and end. I think a lot of readers of Mark's work are frustrated that it's so slow in the making, but his art style is so exacting and he's so demanding of himself that it just does take forever. But I've seen it in pencil form. It's astonishingly beautiful. And I hope we'll all see it before long. And then after that's completed, yes, I think there will be further developments and exploitation to be determined. But I'm glad you're a fan.
Yes. Well, that's great news since like as like I am a fan of a number of different works from a number of different people who a lot of people are like, oh, like I watched all these animated shows when I was a kid, like Avengers: Earth's Mightiest Heroes, Spectacular Spider-Man, and such, and they would get canceled prematurely because of low toy sales and whatever. And people are like, oh, maybe it can come back. Like you hear something from the creators, and you're like, as a fan, waiting is not a problem for me
Okay,
when it comes to hoping for
sure.
hoping for more. But to to my questions to you. Oh, well, first I would like to ask what like inspired you to be a cartoonist? Like, were you always artistically curious or
Well,
fan first?
I would just say growing up as a young kid, I was fascinated with comics. This was an era, keep in mind, I'm growing up in the 1950s when comic books were disproportionately available and visible, and virtually every kid and some adults, closeted adults, were reading them as well. And also keep in mind that most families in those days got at least one daily newspaper thrown on their doorstep every day. And virtually all of those papers had a comic strip section. So I grew
The
up,
old,
yeah, it was when newspapers were healthy and vigorous, and so were comic strips and of course comic books. Their cousin would be on these swirling, you know, racks in every drugstore and variety store and so on. So I had a steady dose of comics that inspired me. And it ran the whole gamut from the funny stuff I liked the best to the adventure things that most boys at the time loved. But I also loved the Uncle Scrooge by Carl Barks, Little Lulu, um, the ones that were kind of offbeat. I like the horror comics, some of the crime comics. So inevitably, I think like most kids, I drew and I enjoy drawing and I began to feel I had a certain facility for it and that cartooning might actually someday be an avocation. Um, of course, at every step, I was told by teachers and counselors and relatives that that was an impossible thing because who knew a cartoonist? Who knew this was possible? It would be like saying to my teachers or friends, I want to act on Broadway. Well, good luck. It's uh, it's not realistic for a kid growing up in Wisconsin.
yeah, I'm a fan of do you know The Adventures of Captain Underpants?
Oh yeah, highly, highly popular. One of the best-selling books out there.
Yeah, well, its creator, Dap Pilkey, like he was autistic, like growing up in the old days. Like he would, I read about his stories and how, like in class, he would just be making, cartoon noises. Then he would just be like thrown out of class to sit in the hallway.
Right.
He would spend more time doodling than doing his work, and the teachers would go like you can draw all you want, but you can't do that for the rest of your life. And Dad Pilkey was like, well, that's exactly what I'm gonna do,
Pretty
and
much. Yeah,
he did that. And
exactly. I think I've heard stand-up comedians say the same thing. It's like the kids who were disruptive in class, trying to make other classmates laugh, usually got in trouble over it. As early as second grade, I was caught showing my homemade comics to classmates, and I thought I was going to be punished. And instead, she said, come to the front of the class and read it to everybody, which I have to say was very smart of that teacher, and it certainly gave me a little more confidence to keep doing it. I can't say that was a definitive moment, but all teachers should be aware that if you have someone in your class who's trying to make someone laugh, whether it's a joke, a cartoon, um, acting out in whatever way, patience and curiosity about what that student is trying to say could be a very pivotal moment in that kid's development. And too often, I think it's suppressed. Not to say you can't eventually overcome it, but it's like anything. If you have a fascination or passion for something early on and you steadily pursue it, you will get better at it. So I'm glad I started in second grade. I didn't have to wait until high school because with every passing month and year, you get a little bit better making that pen make lines that you wanted to. You will eventually get better.
uh,
So, yeah, start early if you can.
well, I I've never been much of a cartoonist myself. I'm more into, I'm a writer. I'm an inspiring writer.
Yep.
But I've read comics my whole life. My dad would read comics to me when I was young, and then I got old enough where I could just, read comics myself. And it was this nightly thing where he would just, come into my room and he would, read me in an issue of the Avengers, and you'd like have all these voices for the
Right.
characters, and like sometimes the issue would end, and I'm like, what? That's how it ends? And he's like, sorry, Matt, you have to wait until tomorrow to
No,
read.
that's great. Sounds like you were lucky. You had a good dad.
Yeah. and I read a little bit about your relationship with your father, and he I feel like who is the more supportive, your father or your mother?
Well, in my case, my father died when I was 13, so I never had that relationship really past my earliest teens. My mother encouraged what I did, but she never really understood it. She had no facility to give me any real critical feedback. She just thought she was good to see me involved in this creative capacity. Um, it's a very poor family, so I early on figured out a way to make literally a few pennies and then a few nickels, and it grew by creating a what I call a newsletter. It was an illustrated 3 pages turned into maybe 5, 6 pages. I wrote it, I illustrated it, mimeographed it, stapled it, sold it. It was a one-man band. And that allowed classmates to see what I was doing, to give me feedback. Um, Sometimes it would include things like salacious gossip or rumors about teachers or whatever I could do to, sensationalize what was going on in a fairly normal Wisconsin classroom. Every time I did that, I was getting a little bit better at writing, at editing, at drawing, at learning what marketing was before no one ever told me that term. Um, Earning money at a time when it was hard to earn money. So that early experience, led me ultimately to become a publisher, which I never would have guessed. I wanted to be a cartoonist, and I evolved quickly into publishing cartoons. Never stopped being a cartoonist. I'm still a cartoonist, but the broad swath of my career has been involved in the business of comics.
Huh.
Uh, Partly because I had apparently a facility for business when very, very few cartoonists have those skills or admit to them.
Yeah, well, my I've taken art classes in college, and I did okay. Like I made like some small comics here and there, like on these like iPads they gave us.
Sure.
And but my sister, like I have a younger sister, she's a self-taught artist, and she's self-taught, how to play the guitar, and she's off in London making movies with her friends and meeting celebrities. Like she's going back to London tonight, and I'm honestly like I'm jealous of her, like how just seamlessly talented she is, and like all these different things, but that I in all these different areas that I wish I could be in. If I had maybe more, if I had more time, more courage in myself with this. But in college, I learned how to, I learned to write in all these different formats, and I got a lot of positive feedback from my professors, and that helped inspire me more. And now I'm just sort of just writing my ideas down for stories whenever I can, trying to expand on them, and hope that maybe I can form them into something that I can make money off of. And I think, yeah, it sounds like you were doing the same thing with your comics, and you were just passing them around in school. But like you were making your own comics and just passing them off for money. Like, how did you see the like industry grow? Like when you're doing just not just like the underground comics, but the more the businesses, the comic industry as well. As you were watching it from like
Well, it certainly evolved, no question. When I was young, there were a handful of, to me, giant companies like Marvel and DC and Dell and Archie and a few others. It's still dominated by the biggest companies, Marvel and DC. Um, but what we have now is a lot of what I would call independent, smaller companies.
Edge.
Um, you know, it's a very competitive marketplace, like almost anything in the creative area. It's a field a lot of people want to get into. Not everyone can succeed. The publishers, of course, are always vying for a market share. When I had Kitchen Sink Press for 30 years, my market radically changed because initially, what you referred to as underground comics were sold outside the mainstream. We had to create our own distribution system. For us, it was head shops, the place where hippies would go to buy their rolling papers and Dayglow posters and other paraphernalia. That was the only business that we had an affinity with. They were kind of outlaw retail organizations, and we were kind of outlaw producers of entertainment for that, call it counterculture, that was very substantial in the late 60s and into the middle and late 70s. And so that was the market I focused on for the first maybe decade. Then hippies got integrated into the larger culture. Head shops were not entirely, but mostly driven out of business or went out of business as circumstances changed. And what happened was the comic book market, as we know it, began to grow with a handful of shops. And eventually that became a network because there were enough organized collectors that people could actually make a living retailing comics just to collectors. So at that point, Kitchen Sink plugged into that market. I was able to successfully switch, and that's not always something that works, but it was how I was able to span 30 years. So I've seen the changes, and they've been very, very dramatic. Certainly, everything from the price of the comics, which were literally a dime when I was a kid,
Ow.
to now $4 or $5, and more for the deluxe comics, and certainly considerably more for graphic novels, which is the other thing that's, totally changed. Up until 1978, there was no such thing as a graphic novel, certainly in America. It was Will Eisner who created Contract with God in 1978 and then inspired a whole new generation of artists and publishers to follow that format, which has given comics a lot more respect. It's allowed things like Will's work, like Art Spiegelman's Mouse and Alan Moore's Watchmen, and a lot of other classics to get mainstream recognition. You can now find these things in every Barnes and Noble and good bookstore, and it would have been impossible before the late 70s to find comics of any kind in a regular bookstore, just as it would have been impossible to find them in any library. Comics had really zero cultural respect. They had a fandom, uh, a very enthusiastic fandom, but that didn't translate to respect until some of those fans grew up and some of them became professors and librarians and uh, and just as a generation began to have more influence on an older generation that never was willing to even look at comics, to consider that they had potential. It was just an entire field. Anything with words and pictures combined, was just automatically considered kid stuff. Now, thankfully, that's changed, and intellectuals are not ashamed to say they are reading graphic novels. At the same time, there are comics and graphic novels being produced for young readers, the way it should be. Um, Typecasting it as kid stuff was wrong from the start, but it took years to figure that all out and find a marketplace that was suddenly willing to buy more adult material. So I'm lucky in that regard. I've seen the field completely revolutionized, I think for the most part, for the better. It's not perfect. Nothing's perfect, right?
No, but yeah, I think comic books are 100% in a better place than they were back when you were starting out. And now, if you make a successful comic, you can get a lot of attention, and you can even get deals of like movies, TV shows, series, video games. Yeah, I think it's more of a cynical point of view of like Hollywood looking for anything they can get ideas off of. But if it makes you more money, it gives you more attention, gives you more connections out in the field, then there's nothing wrong with that. And to go into a lot of the names that you mentioned, Will Eisner, Alan Moore, Stanley. What were your experiences working with those guys?
Well, you threw three names out of what could be a much larger list. It's hard to generalize. I mean, I would sum it up by saying I was very lucky that I got to work with and spend time with, and in many cases, become close friends with people who were my heroes growing up. When I was young and I was reading, especially comics authored by Stan Lee and authored and sometimes illustrated by Harvey Kurtzman, Will Eisner, and a lot of other these giants, never occurred to me, could not dream that I would get to be working with them and publishing their work and so on. So, yeah, I would say that's a little bit of luck, a little bit of skill, a little bit of timing. Um, for the most part, these were great individuals, inspirational in different ways. A Stanley, a showman type, still a very skilled writer, completely different from somebody like an Eisner or Kurtzman or Crumb, who both wrote and drew, and different from, well, maybe an Alan Moore is more like a Stan. They were both principally writers. So my interaction with them varied a great deal from, an occasional project to, in the case of Eisner and Kurtzman and Crumb, to name three the bigger names, I was able to work with them over literally decades and sometimes be involved in the germ of an idea turning into an actual publication, and in some cases having some influence on the content. But for the most part, just giving people I respected the freedom to do what they were best at doing. Meddling is usually not a good recipe for a publisher. The key is to encourage, to give the time, to give the advance where needed, to then promote the hell out of projects you believe in. It's all part of a process, and these things are going on simultaneously. So while I'm working with Harvey Kurtzman on one project, I'm working with Neil Gaiman or an Alan Moore or somebody else on another project, and I have editors at the same time who are reporting to me. So when you get to a certain size, you have an organization, the interconnection becomes more complex. But in a handful of cases, particularly, I would say Eisner and Kurtzman, I was able to develop relationships outside of the office, outside of the business, and those were the most satisfying.
Great to hear. And how do you compare, self-publishing comics now to back then?
Well, again, the market has changed so much, and I would say the biggest probably factor was the development of the internet in the mid 90s, when suddenly you went from a self-publisher who had to literally had enough funds and wherewithal to deal with printers and to be able to store and to distribute, all separate challenges, where the internet opened up new venues where an artist could literally post their work online and have a direct communication with their viewers. You didn't necessarily need the intermediaries. Now, didn't eliminate self-publishing, certainly. It just made it easier. Um, I mean, I can't tell you, I would have loved to have started my business when there was such a thing as an internet, but I had to do what I had to do with a much different market, a much more, I would say, primitive way of reaching the audience. Um, so nowadays, you also have a proliferation of comic conventions where publishers, small press, creators, and fans can all meet at festivals and conventions. Everything from the very largest ones like San Diego and New York Comic Con, where 130,000 plus people might attend, to the smaller shows like SPX and MICE, and the ones that are held in smaller cities where a few thousand people might meet. But those are also critically important. I mean, in my view, even more important because I think the most exciting stuff is being done with small press, and I most enjoy attending those small shows now. I've stopped going to San Diego and most of the larger shows because they're just too dominated to my taste by superheroes, by TV and movie industry and toy industry and game industry, and much less about comics, even if it's called a comic convention. Whereas the small press places are virtually 100% about comics and storytelling. And it's about individuals who have something to say and to share. To me, that's much more exciting. So, yeah, in every way, um, the market has changed. And as a person who always will associate with the small press, I think it's certainly, again, advantageous today. It's easier to find that audience. That said, um, it's also such a congested, the right word, a congested field that if you are small press today and you have booths at places like SPX and MICE and the others, you might be lucky to sell, a couple hundred, a few hundred of your books, and consider yourself very lucky. 1,000 or a couple thousand might be on the outside of your expectation. Back in what I call the more primitive days, when I was doing underground comics, I would sell a minimum of 10,000 of every title, a minimum. That's what
Wow.
I would start with. And as soon as it sold out, we would print another 10,000. And we would continue to do that until there was no longer demand. So I think I sound maybe a little self-contradictory because it was, in a sense, easier to do it then because I had far less competition. There were basically three other publishers aside from Kitchen Sink Press publishing underground comics, and we had an audience of, I don't know how to measure it, certainly hundreds of thousands of hippies, if not, you know, in the low millions. I don't know how to put a number on that, but we could reach um, a great deal of those prospects through these head shops, and there just wasn't that much to select from. Um, Today, there are hundreds and hundreds of small press, self-published people all vying to sell their work. And even with the advantage of these periodic conventions and the advantages of websites and internet connections, it's still hard to sell more than three digits, four digits of these things. So that's the contrast. That's the yin and the yang of it. I, uh, I, in some respects, envy the young people who are putting out things now, and I'm thinking they have so many advantages. At the same time, I realize how frustrating it is to be in a market where there's so many creative people putting out so many publications and trying to sell it to what probably, possibly is a smaller audience. Um, so, again, things will continue to change, and it may be that a form of distribution will occur. Um, Already, I think print on demand is an amazing thing. You could write something, put it on Amazon, and on a print on demand basis, even if only 10 people bought it this year, it's still 10 more people than it just sitting in your computer. And if you're lucky, word gets around and you sell scores or hundreds or whatever. So I think it's a combination of if you create something really innovative, really something that speaks to a lot of other people, it will, with any luck and any push, it will find an audience that may grow and grow. So I still think, on balance, today's more advantageous. Take advantage.
Well, yeah, you saying that like there's like there was less competition back then than there is now. That reminds me of something that Joe Hill once said. He's Stephen King's son. He's a I remember reading him saying that well, like back before like 20 30 years ago, the comic industries they were like afraid to publish anything other than superhero comics. It was all superhero comics. Now like new younger generations, they're making comic books about whatever they want. There's The Walking Dead. There was with Robert Kirkman, Saga with Brian K. Vaughan. It's
Right.
all it's all these different genres, and it's it was like reading those comics. I
Oh,
read
absolutely.
I read The Walking Dead, and that was like my big like groundbreaking. It was like my mind blew like wow, like you can. It doesn't have to just be superheroes. Like my dad read me Bone. Do you know Bone?
Sure.
It
Sure.
was yeah, like Jeff Smith. It was this yeah, it was it was just like so imaginative to me. And
Bone was great. I read Bone to my youngest daughter as she was growing up. Jeff Smith, yeah, was one of those, I'd say, breakthrough cartoonists who created a comic book series initially aimed at fans, but they were able to work out a deal with, was it Scholastic? I forget, where millions of young readers were able to get it. Um, and so whenever you see a breakout like Bone or Walking Dead and Saga, there are others. Yes, it's very encouraging. I'm personally glad to see that the industry eventually broke away from the kind of monolithic superhero um, genre. I long ago feel I outgrew the superheroes, and I could be wrong. You might recommend something to me, and I go, "Hey, that's very different. I enjoyed it." But for the most part, it's just not a genre that interests me. I kind of bored by the idea of somebody with a cape and superpowers. It's like, please give me a realistic story with realistic characters and problems and situations I can relate to that I can learn something from. I can't remember anything I've learned from Spider-Man or whatever. Not to dismiss them as entertaining, And I think, especially for young readers, read whatever you will. But I think at a certain point, and that age will vary for some, for me, it was my college years, you just show interest in different things. And what was interesting when you were maybe a teenager is no longer interesting in your 20s or 30s or 50s or 70s. And that's just a natural progression. Comics are no different than the kind of novels you read, the kind of TV shows, the kind of movies you watch. You know, our tastes evolve. And I'm just glad that there are comics for everyone now. When I was young, I didn't have that luxury. Your generation and the younger generation, they can find a comic or graphic novel on virtually any topic, any aspect of history, any personal experience. It's mind-boggling. It's impossible to keep up. And I think that's great.
Yeah, I grew up in a very fortunate generation where there's like so many creative outlets for imaginative people, and like
Yep.
so many video games used to just be these pixelated these like simple pixelated ways for kids to play at
Oh yeah.
arcades,
Oh
and
yeah.
now they're like just multi-million-dollar productions with
Right.
realistic graphics. It's just how things evolve. And it's really inspiring just to see like how like the fans grew up and became the creators. And they somebody said, "Wow, I'd love to do this on a larger scale," and they did.
Right.
And it's just and like it's like that with comics too, where the underdogs sort of took over the industry in a sense.
Well, I wouldn't go that far, but certainly have been inroads.
So as you're saying, like I said, like the underdogs took over the industry, and you're like, not quite.
Um, I think I thought I heard you say that the upstarts were beginning to take over. I mean, to me, Marvel and DC are still so dominant,
Oh yeah,
you know.
100%. But now they have more competition with
Yeah,
all these
it's
other.
good. I like, for example, Image's market shares seems to be pretty solid and maybe growing a little. And I like the fact that they back mostly creator-owned properties, and they have a much more progressive way of sharing revenue than obviously the giant corporations where everything is work for hire. And so, yeah, I think it's a good sign. Um, the, of course, for in contrast to Image, you have dozens of much smaller independent publishers scrambling to maybe get 1% or 0.5% share. And then below that, you have the micro publishers and the single artist self-publishers. So there's a spectrum up in that publishing ocean of whales down to plankton. And so it was always thus in a sense. But way back in the earliest days of comics, there were a lot of publishers for a newsstand audience that seemed insatiable in terms of audience. The best-selling comics in the late 40s were selling several million each every month. Things like Captain Marvel and Crime Does Not Pay, multi-million copies every month. It's staggering. So today, I mean, I may refer to Marvel and DC as dominant giants in the field, but in contrast, a best-selling comic book for them today rarely hits even 100,000.
Yeah,
Um, for them now, the numbers are much closer to what I would call underground comics numbers. Um, it's just there's a lot of them. You've got the multiplier effect, and they still obviously make a profit. It's even with inflation, a lot easier to make a profit off of a $5 comic than a 10-cent comic or whatever. So, so yeah, look, the market's going to continue to evolve, and I think as a as a young writer, you need to be aware of that market because you have to decide what's the best way for you to plug into it. And any of your listeners in a similar position, there's always going to be a need for, I hate to say product because we're talking about something creative and artistic, but for the purpose of the market, it is product. And so if you want to become part of that, you have to figure out, am I going to write for one of the giants because I like superheroes and I want to write scripts for the Avengers and X-Men or whatever and get well paid for it? Or do I want to write comics that are the ones I want to write, not what someone tells me? I want to create characters I own, not the company. So between those contrasts, you've got to figure out, do I want to make easier money writing or drawing for a big company, or do I want to strike out on my own or work a deal with a smaller publisher that will be much more fair, where I might make less money and sell fewer comics or graphic novels, but I'll own the copyright and I'll control my destiny more. These are choices any creator still has to make. In my, in my case, when I decided to do underground comics, I was young enough. I was not married and had children and had obligations that kind of forced my hand. I was able to do what maybe seems like the braver choice. It was just for me, I was willing to go through a period of being literally a starving cartoonist. I uh, I was economically deprived for at least a couple of years before I started to make any money at all. And it was still years before I made respectable money. I was just willing to do it. And the more complicated your life becomes, i.e., relationship where you have obligations like a spouse or a parent, whatever, or the other alternative path many take is you have a day job and then you use your free evenings or weekends when you can to write or draw. And those are basically the choices. And, you know, over the years, I've seen every combination of those, from those that were very successful in any of those choices to those who had to drop out after a while, either just from being burned out or being unable to make even a borderline living, or discouraged by poor sales, or sometimes just the politics of the business. Um, I found over the years a lot of people attracted to this field are on the autism spectrum. And for a lot of people on that spectrum, it's very difficult to be aggressive on your own behalf. It's hard to interact with large crowds, even like conventions where you might have fans. It's still difficult, at least for a long period of time. So I've seen so many combinations and variations. I'm always reluctant to give advice other than early on, or at least at some point, you have to decide, am I going to write and draw comics for an audience I perceive, for a need I perceive, typically through someone who pays me to do that? Or am I going to write and draw essentially for myself and have confidence that others will like what I want to do? And the latter choice is definitely a dangerous one. And that path of success is a lot narrower. On the other hand, some of the most successful things that have been done in comics were through that path. Um, I mean, I mentioned Art Spiegelman earlier. Mouse was not something that looked like it would be a bestseller. My understanding is every publisher in New York turned down Mouse.
Oh,
It was it was only when Art met another editor from Pantheon company that had already turned it down. The second editor said, "Well, let me take a look at it," and it finally got accepted. So, if something that won the Pulitzer Prize was rejected by every major house in New York City, how can you expect to even trust editors that the work you create might be a work of genius as well, and they may not see it? So I throw these thoughts out there just because, again, there is no single path. And even things that we look at in retrospect as successful may have had a very rocky or circuitous path to success. And so in the end, there's no there's no simple formula other than to be patient and dogged in pursuit of your goals. And again, I think I mentioned you have to have a little bit of luck. You have to meet the right people, the right editor, the right publisher, the right collaborator at the right time. That's why I encourage at if you you or any of your listeners attend any comics convention or festival, whether large or small, after that show is over at 5 o'clock or whatever, and people go out to grab a meal, and typically, not everyone, but typically, professionals will navigate to the nearest hotel bar. There might be two or three hotels. I have found over the years the best way to meet people who might help you is hang out at those places. Again, be patient, be personable, be funny, be willing to buy drinks for somebody who's an editor or a publisher or just a colleague, and just be willing to meet and talk about comics and the business of comics until that bar closes. And if you're lucky, there'll be a party at someone's hotel room afterwards. Go to that one. There might only be five people, but one of them might be an agent, might be an editor, might be someone a year or two ahead of you in the professional path. And every time you have a chance to talk to those people, you're learning a little bit more and you're getting a business card, you're getting a phone number, you're getting an email that might lead to that break you need. And that's what I call luck, not necessarily luck. Luck is where you find it. And I find a lot of comic creators are just too shy or fill in the blank to be willing to that kind of networking. Networking is work. It helps if you have an outgoing personality. I was lucky. I did. I was shy when I was young. I overcame it. Not everyone can. If you're shy, you have to force yourself. Or sometimes maybe you just hang out with a friend who's very personable, and that friend is the door opener, and that friend attracts the people, and you just happen to be in that friend circle when he introduces you to someone who can help you. Again, no simple single path, and I don't want to go on blathering forever, but I just want to stress, since you and presumably some of your listeners are at an early stage of your career, to use a cliche, think out of the box, but it's a true cliche. And just writing privately, just drawing privately or within a small circle, rarely leads to a breakout. You got to meet people who can help you break out. And most of them are happy to help. There's nothing an editor likes more than discovering new talent. Uh, so meet those people and through whatever it takes, get your manuscripts or your sample pages in their hands. And they may be brutally honest. They may say to you, look, your idea is fine, but your plotting is inadequate. Here's why. Or whatever they tell you, not necessarily great advice, but it is advice. I would listen respectfully, and maybe they're right. Maybe if you make those changes, it's acceptable. So you've got to, in a way, have a strong enough ego to let you try to navigate through the waters that lead to getting published in wider and wider places. At the same time, you've got to keep your ego out of under your own control so that you can accept honest criticism, which can hurt, but as you get better, um, ultimately it only helps your ego because the better your work gets, the more reason you have for your ego to be proud. So it's finding that check, reining it in at the same time, never losing that ego that really ultimately is your that salesperson you need that has to have faith in you. So I hope that's helpful. I know I'm rambling, but
Oh no, it's
I've
great. It's
I've
great.
seen
Thank you.
I've seen I've seen a lot of paths over the years, and I would just encourage looking at all the options.
Yeah, well, yeah, I guess like even though I'm just out of college, like my experience is that yeah, it's like a writing job will not just fall right in your lap. You gotta keep searching, you gotta keep working, and it's what you said. Yeah, I gotta have like the discipline to keep improving on myself, and I gotta make sure I meet the right people. Like I'm an introvert, but I'm also a friendly person, so I try to. Yeah, I met like a whole ton of people at Mice. I have a whole bunch of
Right.
business cards, a whole bunch of contact information, and I want to I want to interview them as well. Ask them for advice. Ask them if they like they need a like an intern or something. Which
Exactly.
speaking of which, you got anything for me?
Well, the problem is you're getting me too late. I'm semi-retired at this point, and I don't know when I'll be fully retired. But basically, I don't have a publishing company anymore. I don't really have an entity anymore that needs interns. But it's great you asked, and that's an example of you got to be assertive. You describe yourself as essentially an introvert, but you have a friendly personality. I saw you at Mice. You came up to my table. You were very friendly. It led to this.
Thank
So
you.
what you're doing already, you're seeing some signs of it working. I would encourage it at every other show you can practically attend. And if, Mice is the only one you get to regularly because you're in Boston, so be it. But if you can get to, again, some of the bigger shows, it probably wouldn't hurt. The other advantage of those shows is um, don't just look for contacts that can help you. Look for exhibitors, small press and self-published creators who you should maybe look at because either, for example, you might meet an artist who is putting out self-made booklets of their drawings, but they don't write, but you like their style. And you might say to them, hey, I'm a writer. I'm not an artist. Maybe we could work together on some things. Now,
Thought about that.
yeah, and again, that's not always going to work. And you might talk to a dozen or dozens of artists before you really find the right match. Because again, there are some artists who might be able to draw, but they don't know how to tell a story. You might have to work more closely with an artist like that than someone who's fully immersed in comics as a storytelling medium, and it's easier for them. But you're probably both at early stages of a career, and hopefully you learn from each other. But again, I would make any of those festival or convention appearances as immersive as possible. And if you can't, for example, hang out with an editor, a publisher, or an agent after hours, find creators you can hang out with. And again, you're talking shop. That's what Will Eisner used to call it. Um, you meet someone, you have a drink together, maybe it's lunch, you talk over a sandwich, but it's basically how far have you gotten? And for example, somebody might have said, oh, I worked for this little company XYZ, and they treated me really well. They paid me on time. They used a really quality printer. They made sure I was happy. So when you hear someone talk about a small publisher in glowing ways, that's a publisher you want to talk to. Conversely, you're going to talk to creators who say, yeah, I gave my stuff to that publisher and they never paid me and the printing is crappy, whatever. So you learn things. And sometimes it just saves you from wasting time with that publisher that might rip you off, and it steers you toward one that's more reliable. Everything you learn is going to be helpful. I would, I used to always carry a little notebook in my pocket. I would jot things down. You don't have to literally do that, but try to remember. Maybe it's your iPad or your iPhone, whatever. Whenever you get something specific, it's good to jot it down. It may not be helpful immediately. That company that was recommended or dissed may not mean anything until 6 months or a year later when you somehow have contact with that entity and you go, wait, is that the one I was warned about? Or is that the one I was told was great? It's easy to forget details if you don't keep notes. I find that's another just helpful thing professionally in general. Um, as a writer, you probably want to have a journal anyway, um, whether it's literally a diary or it's just writing down thoughts, or you might be riding a bus or sitting in a restaurant and you hear snippets of a conversation and you go, wow, I love that line. You write it down thinking that's going to be in one of my stories one day. It's perfect. I don't know exactly where, but I'm going to use it someday. And the more you do that, the more these things start to connect and interconnect. And you, you're just in the same way. If you were an artist, I would tell you constantly be sketching and carry that sketchbook with you everywhere. Um, I don't mean, you're drawing 24/7, but if you find yourself, again, even sitting in a restaurant or someplace where you have time to watch people, just draw expressions, draw what does that fork and plate look like at your table? Everything you draw, everything you write about, it's going to come in handy later when that artist might have to draw a fork without having a fork in front of them, or write a scene that you remember, but you don't remember as well as if you had written down the details. You know, a bus station is boring, but if you describe that boring bus station, at some point you're going to be writing a script or a novel, and it's going to have a boring bus station in it. And all those grimy details that you would have forgotten are in your notebook. These are things that are critical for anyone from both the writing and the drawing end who are going to go into comics. You are first and foremost an observer. And second, you are a storyteller. And so every moment you're alive, every snippet is something contributing to your later retelling that in some way or making it a component of a story. I got to stress that. It's maybe boring, for some uninspiring, but some of the coolest sketchbooks I've ever seen were very ordinary objects that artists drew because they were ordinary. Ordinary observations can turn into insightful inspiration in prose. You got to start somewhere. And it's like mining for gold. You know, you got to mine tons and tons of earth to get a few nuggets of gold. Prose is the same way. I'm sure for every great writer, every page they wrote, there were many pages they tore up or burned or erased. Sorry, got off track again, right?
Oh no, it's fine. It's fine. Just want to see if you had anything else to add. And like everything you said for, yeah, I've I've done a little bit of that. Like if I have like a conversation or I hear something, yeah, I try to, yeah, like, I write it down. Like I got these I think like I got like maybe 20 something pages worth of notes for potential stories or whatever. Like I went to the Massachusetts Museum of Science like at the end of the year, and I had this interesting meeting with somebody there, and it just I was like, wow, this is a it was this weird conversation where you're watching these two balls, like they roll around in this like disc thing, and it was like momentum to see like which one was going to go into this hole at the center, and he was like, "Oh, it's a metaphor for life,"
Hmm.
and like from that, I was like, "Huh, like you can, you could use I could use this for something,"
Good.
and for yeah, in terms of like, oh, you can I can team up with an artist and I've read web comics that have had great art, but then like something happens between the writer and the artist leaves, and then they get a new artist, or they get different artists, and like it it caused me to lose interest in the comic because one part like okay, well they don't have an artist, so they miss deadlines, and when they get a new artist, it's just not the same. I feel like the comic never recovers after that, but I've read other comics which are like also like slices of life, where it just like makes fun of the sort of the averageness of everything. Where it was just simple conversation with a joke at the end, or or just a little nitpick about I guess like maybe something that was peeving the writer at the time. When and he said, "Oh wait, I can use this into I can use this into like a 4 panel comic page."
Right.
And and that brings me to something you said about oh like a publisher could screw you over. Yeah, I know like you fought for creator rights back in the day. Like how have those changed over the years, over the decades? And for like self publishers.
Well, again, when I started, um, it's hard to describe to a younger generation, but the options were very few. And I had the opportunity to work for Marvel. I literally worked for Stan Lee for a year, um, but I did it from Wisconsin. I negotiated an arrangement where I could work from my own office, but I worked for Marvel for a year. And it's I don't want to say it was a horrible experience. I learned a lot and I liked Stan personally. But the way large companies mass produce comics is not the way I wanted to make comics. And so for me, a critical thing is whenever possible, an artist slash writer own the rights to their own work. To me, that's crucial. Now, if you're going to say draw Spider-Man, of course Marvel owns Spider-Man. Of course you have to sign a work for hire agreement. Duh, I get it. And I cast no aspersions on the artist or writer who wants to work on Spider-Man. That's a perfectly legitimate occupation. God bless you. But for me and the audience I wanted to reach and the colleagues I wanted to work with, for us, it was to create stories that we ultimately control. So if we create a character that becomes famous, we're the ones who get to exploit it and license it as our choice. If somebody in another country wants to translate it, it's up to us whether to authorize that, etc. Everything about ownership, of course, by definition, is empowering. And I was that spear tip of a new generation that demanded that and got it with what we now call underground comics, which have in turn evolved into alternative slash indie slash small, whatever you want to call what's happened in more recent decades. And now it's pretty much a given. And uh, even the copyright laws changed in, I think, around 1978, so that you automatically own your copyright unless you expressly sign it over to a publisher or an employer. So it's easy for a new generation to take for granted, oh, I own my own stuff, of course. It, when I was young, it had to be fought for, it had to be demanded, it had to be carved out. And uh, the same for me was the case with censorship. I just inherently didn't like the idea of somebody telling us what we could publish, what we could distribute, and so that led eventually to the formation of the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, which was technically a 501(c)(3) nonprofit corporation, which basically protects First Amendment rights in the comics industry. And I founded that because I became aware of situations where initially retailers were being pressured to drop carrying some comics that I thought were perfectly valid and in fact exemplary that cops, for whatever reason, didn't think were. Um, so that's why the CBLDF was set up to protect retailers and, in a larger sense, creators and publishers and everyone involved in the industry. It was, again, seeing a vacuum and trying to fill it. And I think for every subsequent generation, there's going to be a cause. Um, I mean, headlines just the last couple of weeks or so. For instance, the editorial cartoonist at the Washington Post who quit because Jeff Bezos did not want her to publish an anti-Trump, anti-Bezos cartoon. Well, to me, that's outrageous. She had the integrity to quit. A lot of other cartoonists have come out in her support, but it's a kind of thing that after it's in the headlines for a few days, it may evaporate. People forget about it, but it's very, very important that we not forget it. Already, editorial cartoonists are like a dying breed, just the way newspapers sadly are. a dying vehicle for news. I think every time a cartoonist has to quit because they can't voice their political opinion, it's another step toward a country where all opinion is eventually stifled. It's critical that we do everything we can to fight for free expression. And comics are the little corner of the world that my career has been involved with. Editorial cartoonist takes my cousins. I call editorial cartoonists my cousins, and they're working in a very difficult medium, and they come under the same kind of stress on every level, including in this case censorship. And we need to be unified. We need to be unified in general about any corporate or governmental efforts to stifle opinion. The other side of that coin, of course, is social media, where hate mongers and people who make up shit also want the right to say whatever they want. So then it's always, well, what's truthful, what's not truthful? These are endless arguments, but it still begins for me with free expression. And hopefully, in the end, the truth, or as close to the truth as possible, will prevail. But it's not automatic. These are battles fought constantly, and every generation has a new one. To me, social media is one of the best and worst things that's ever happened to humanity,
Yeah,
you know?
definitely. And
So that's your problem to solve. I'm too old to solve that problem.
yeah,
Um, but good luck with it, you know?
well, yeah, I read about Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, the creators of Superman, and how they were basically screwed out of the rights of Superman and had to
Yep.
fight for their names on the Superman movie. And I think it wasn't until like recently that their families, got full rights to the characters, or at least got,
Well, no,
maybe not full rights, but
that didn't happen. The corporation that owns DC has tried to mollify the family by, yes, making certain royalty payments and treating them in a more fair way than they were historically. Um, they went through years of litigation to try to get back the rights to Superman, and that failed. It was probably a doomed effort, but they did fight it for years. Um, I mean, the problem is they signed an onerous contract way back in like 1938, was it? And were never really able to get out of it. Um, and that's another lesson with, I always try to tell every young cartoonist, writer, illustrator, is learn to read a basic contract and don't assume, that you have to sign it just because it's handed to you. A lot of things in contracts are negotiable, and a publisher or any employer who demands a work for hire or a similar contract, they're going to try to get you to sign their standard language because it's easiest for them and it's most protective of their interests. But many artists do have the opportunity to renegotiate some aspects. Um, if you're selling enough that you might be able to attract an agent, that's your agent's job, really, is to negotiate those points on your behalf because the agent is presumably much more experienced with the nuances of contracts and also to know where a publisher might give, on some of the bargaining points. But any artist who says, "Oh, I don't want to read a contract, I don't care about contracts," they're doing a disservice to themselves. You really need to understand just fundamental contract language. And a good contract should be written in simple enough English that you don't need a legal dictionary. But where you do, look up those words. Um, it's important. And again, the smaller the publisher, the more likely their contract is malleable. The larger they are, the more difficult it gets. But even the largest publisher, if they want your skills and they want to employ your talents, they may be perfectly willing to negotiate or bargain or compromise on some of the points that are most important to you. So that's another one of the things on the to-do list that has nothing to do with your creative skills. It has to do with protecting your legal rights.
Wow, that's a lot to consider, and I'm really happy that you were able to have an effect on that for so many future creators over the years. Okay, Mr. Kitchen, I just wanted to say thank you so much for allowing me to have this interview with you. My last few questions are I know you said that you're mostly retired, but is there anything else that you're working on at the moment? I know that you obviously you've released your book, everything, including the kitchen sink, which goes over your history in the industry, which is so fascinating. But is there anything else, like anything with other creators?
Well, sure. When I say a semi-retired, I'm removing myself from any remaining agency and publishing obligations. Um, but I'm not going to stop being a creator. So I still am drawing and writing, working on some projects. I had a book come out a couple of years ago called Creatures from the Subconscious, series
Cool.
of surrealistic drawings done on what I call chipboard. There's a sequel to that coming out. Um, uh, I just did a painting of of a Krampus devil for an art exhibit in Los Angeles. I'm working on a page actually this week that'll be in a anthology collection, and I'm doing commissions. So yeah, I'm still active as an artist and a writer. I've been asked to do various introductions and forwards to things, and so I'm probably as busy as ever, but it's not the kind of traditional work I was doing for others as a literary agent or a publisher or another professional capacity. So thanks for asking. Um, I'm not hanging it up yet.
Yeah, well, it's good to hear that. And I like looking through your book. I saw like you had your work has been like very diverse through the years, and so that basically your underground comics was it's mostly like surrealist stuff, humor, and of course porn. That was like that was like the stuff that like it was. I could like imagining like drug sales like, oh, you love Superman, well this is the good stuff right here, and that's basically
No,
what the sort of the underground or the self-publishing industry is like nowadays. If like web comics, online comics, and such, it's more or less the same thing. It's just people creating whatever they want that you probably couldn't find at your normal comic book store. And I was wondering, like what works have you done that you're the most proud of out of everything you've done over the decades?
well, that's kind of like asking me
Or your favorite? Who's your favorite
which
children?
babies are my favorite. I guess I would just start by saying I'm very proud of having been able to publish some of the giants in comics field, like Harvey Kurtzman, Will Eisner, Robert Crumb, Neil Gaiman, Alan Moore, Mark Schultz, Howard Cruz, Trina Robbins. I mean, go down the list of people that those I'm certainly proud of. As far as maybe individual projects, if something like gay comics, only I guess because at the time there was nothing like it in the market, and it helped inspire a generation of gay cartoonists to have a vehicle they could draw their own experiences for. So That one has stood out more in recent years as more gay cartoonists have told me it was important. Um, there is one called Kings in Disguise that is not as well known as it should be, but that was a very early graphic novel that I helped assemble first by meeting the writer at a convention in Dallas. He gave me his idea while we were drinking cocktails. I liked the idea, told him to follow up in an email, shared the idea with my editor, who also liked it. We decided let's find the right artist for it. We recommended an artist. They ended up working together. And to me, it was one of the finest of certainly certainly the early graphic novels. And I think it stands the test of time, Kings in Disguise. It wouldn't have happened if I had not done what I talked to you earlier about, meeting somebody, liking an idea, following up, making the puzzle pieces work. It's not always like that, but that one stands out as a happy result of a formula that I recommend. Um, I would say there are also a number of anthologies I did over the years where young and new talent was able to break in, maybe just with a page or two, and then develop a larger career. Joe Matt comes to mind. He first appeared in an anthology called Snarf, and then he built a much larger career based on that little stepping stone. There were many others over the years, too many to recount. You got to remember, Kitchen Sink Press alone lasted for 30 years, and if you stretch it into my own drawing career and agenting career, it's literally oh, what, 55 years. So it's hard to single out individual projects. I'm sure I forgot some terrific ones.
Well, what you said about the, like, choosing between your works, like, choosing between, like, oh, which child is your favorite. Well, maybe this might be a slightly easier uh question. What would be, if I wanted to ask you about, your favorite children, it would be like, well, what would be your favorite memories,
Yeah.
or anything that, you just sort of like you think back on throughout your career as sort of like, highlights, like you've you've talked about your time with all these great creators, great publishers. So that, like, to finish it up, maybe, maybe like talk about like a memory or two that sort of defined everything, or just something, some small thing you liked.
That's a tough one, Matt. I'm not sure I can summarize it with a single anecdote or two. I would say it swirls around. It's like a big hurricane that just covers the calendars month after month, and there are always so many things simultaneously happening. So as I might be considering a new project at the same day we're putting an old project to bed that we've worked on for months. Um, and all of this is happening simultaneously. And well, again, as the company got bigger, keep in mind things I might have had my hands on more personally began to get delegated. At one point, I had, I think, five editors reporting to me, plus marketing staff and legal staff and production staff, and we would have staff meetings. And so things that I once was very hands-on, I became more indirectly involved. So publishing in some ways became more abstract as the company got bigger. What really stands out among all that swirl is really more the personal relationships that were developed. Uh, say, pick a Will Eisner as an obvious example. I probably published 20 different books by him and well over 100 comic books and magazines and whatnot. And they blur, but Will himself is the lasting memory, and getting to know him as a person and not simply as a creator. and getting to know him as an older mentor who had been involved in the industry long before me and who could occasionally give me advice when I would get into an unprecedented situation or an obstacle I was grappling with. I could count on him to give me honest advice that was frequently very helpful. The same was true for Harvey Kurtzman and even contemporaries of mine who were the same age. You, at the end, it's the friendships and the relationships that I think stand out the most. And I would urge you and any of your listeners and colleagues who intend to be in this field or any field for a long lifetime, you'll be involved probably in countless interesting things. And if you take notes like I recommended, you'll remember it all easier. But when you get to be my age, um, what stands out the most is the moments, the hours, the days you spent with people you respected, loved, cherish. Um, that's the important stuff. And I have lots of those. I'm a very lucky man.
Well, I'm so glad that you've had such an excellent and interesting life and career, and you've given me like so much advice. Like you've given me like more advice than I could have thought possible on this. Is there else that you could tell me, someone who wants to break into the industry before we end things?
Well, remind me of that when you're a bestseller, okay, Matt? All right.
Uh, okay,
So
so
it was a pleasure talking to you. Good luck
okay,
to yourself, your career, your podcasting.
I'm a podcaster. I'm a writer for J1 Studios and occasional YouTuber, but
Got it. A YouTuber. Okay. My apology.
fine.
And hopefully I'll run into you at a future mice or another event.
And same to you. And anything else you'd like to add for me?
I think I've talked too much. Your
Oh.
last listener is already falling asleep.
uh, well, I'm not, and I think that's more important. But
Okay.
have a great day. Have a great year. Have a great everything, Dennis Kitchen. And once again, thank you so much for the book. I will promote it. And have a have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, man. Bye-bye.